Would you be able to resist a stunning maid who knows just how to catch your eye, how to ignite a fire within you that you thought had long burned out? What if she entered your life when you were at your most vulnerable, lonely, unfulfilled, yearning for the passion that had faded from your marriage? This is the story of a husband who couldn't resist her allure, a man who let desire lead him down a path of betrayal, risking everything he held dear. What began as a forbidden affair in the shadows of his own home spiraled into a devastating chain of events that would shatter multiple lives. How could a secret romance lead to such tragic consequences? And what price did he ultimately pay for giving in to temptation? In the dimly lit living room, David Thompson sat alone, staring blankly at the television that flickered with a show he wasn't really watching. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the emptiness that had come to define his marriage. His wife, Emily, once vibrant and full of life, had changed after the birth of their 2 children. The woman he had fallen in love with had been replaced by someone he barely recognized, a woman who had grown distant, her body softening with the years and the demands of motherhood. He didn't blame her entirely. The stress of raising 2 kids, managing the household, and the relentless march of time had taken their toll. But that didn't ease his growing dissatisfaction. His once passionate marriage had turned cold, the intimacy they once shared now a distant memory. His heart ached with loneliness, his body yearning for the warmth and connection he so desperately missed. Then she arrived. The maid was a vision of temptation. Hired to help around the house, Priya was a young woman from India, her beauty exotic and intoxicating. She moved with a grace that caught his eye immediately, her slender figure accentuated by the tight-fitting clothes she wore, a deliberate choice, he soon realized, designed to catch his attention. At first, he tried to ignore the way she seemed to linger near him, the subtle glances she cast his way, the way her hand would lightly brush his arm as she passed by. But it was impossible to resist the pull he felt toward her. She was everything he had been missing: young, vibrant, and attentive. Her presence filled the void Emily had left, and he found himself drawn to her more and more each day. Priya knew exactly what she was doing. She would bend just a little too far while cleaning, revealing the smooth skin of her back, or wear skirts just short enough to show a tantalizing glimpse of her thighs. Her dark eyes would meet his, a knowing smile playing on her lips, as if she could sense his growing desire. One afternoon, while Emily was out shopping and the children were at school, the tension between them finally broke. Priya was dusting the shelves in the living room when David entered. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the air was thick with unspoken words. She smiled, a seductive curve of her lips, and slowly, deliberately, she walked toward him. He could feel his heart racing, his breath quickening as she approached. When she was close enough to touch, she didn't hesitate. Her hand reached out, lightly brushing his chest before trailing down to rest on his waist. The touch sent a shiver through him, a surge of desire that he had not felt in years. "You seem tense," she whispered, her voice low and sultry. "Let me help you relax." Before he could respond, she leaned in, her lips grazing his ear as she spoke, her warm breath sending waves of excitement through him. Her hands moved to his shoulders, gently massaging the tension from his muscles, and he felt himself relax under her touch, the last remnants of his resistance melting away. He turned to face her, his hands finding their way to her waist, pulling her closer. Their faces were inches apart, and he could see the desire in her eyes, mirroring his own. He hesitated for just a moment, but the longing he had been suppressing for so long was too powerful to resist. Their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, testing the waters. But once the barrier was broken, the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. His hands roamed her body, feeling the curves beneath her clothes, and she responded in kind, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pressed herself against him. The kiss ignited a fire in him that had been smoldering for far too long. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of desire was a release of the pent-up frustration that had been building inside him. He was lost in the moment, in the feel of her body against his, in the sensation of being wanted, needed, once again. As they kissed, he knew that there was no turning back. This was just the beginning of something forbidden, something dangerous. But in that moment, with her in his arms, nothing else mattered. The passion that had been missing from his life was back, and he was willing to risk everything to keep it. The days following that first kiss were a whirlwind of secret glances and stolen moments. The air between them crackled with a chemistry that was impossible to ignore. Whenever they were alone, the tension was palpable, pulling them together like magnets. What had started as a brief, hesitant kiss quickly spiraled into something much more intense. One afternoon, when the house was quiet and the children were napping, David found Priya in the kitchen. The sunlight streaming through the window bathed her in a warm glow, highlighting the curve of her waist as she stood at the counter. She was wearing a simple dress, but the way it hugged her body made his pulse quicken. Unable to resist, he approached her, his footsteps silent on the tiled floor. She sensed him before he touched her, turning slightly, a smile already forming on her lips. His hand slid around her waist, pulling her back against him as he leaned in to kiss the side of her neck. She let out a soft sigh, tilting her head to give him better access, her hands pausing in their work as she melted into his embrace. Their connection was electric, each touch sending waves of pleasure through their bodies. His hands roamed her curves, exploring every inch of her as if he were committing her to memory. She responded eagerly, her body pressing back against his, her breath hitching in anticipation. They moved together, their kisses growing more passionate, more desperate. Her hands slid down his chest, tracing the lines of his muscles before slipping beneath his shirt. The feel of her fingers on his skin made him groan softly, his desire for her growing with every second. In a flurry of motion, they found themselves in the bedroom. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in a world that was just their own, where nothing else existed but the two of them and the fire that burned between them. He laid her gently on the bed, their eyes locking in a moment of pure, unspoken understanding. The tension that had been building for days finally broke as their lips met again, this time with an intensity that took his breath away. Their clothes were discarded hastily, forgotten in their eagerness to be closer, to feel skin against skin. As he hovered over her, their bodies pressed together, she reached up to pull him down, their lips meeting in a kiss that was as much a promise as it was an expression of their desire. Her hands roamed his back, pulling him closer, urging him on as they moved together in a rhythm that felt both natural and new. Their passion was overwhelming, a force that neither could control. Every touch, every kiss was a release of the tension they had both been carrying, a surrender to the need that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. He could feel her heart racing beneath his palm as he touched her, her skin warm and soft under his fingers. As their bodies entwined, their moans filled the room, a symphony of pleasure that echoed in his ears. She was everything he had been craving, everything he had been missing. He had forgotten what it felt like to be so alive, to be so connected to another person. With her, he was free to feel, to desire, to love in a way he hadn't in years. They moved together in perfect harmony, their bodies responding to each other with a natural ease. Each touch was a promise, each kiss a vow to keep this secret, to hold onto this forbidden connection for as long as they could. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Afterward, they lay tangled together, their breathing heavy, their bodies still buzzing with the afterglow of their passion. He stroked her hair as she rested her head on his chest, their silence comfortable and content. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt truly alive, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. But it wasn't just in the bedroom where their connection flourished. He started coming home early, eager to see her, to steal more moments together. They would find excuses to be alone, whether it was a quick kiss in the hallway or a lingering touch in the kitchen. Their passion knew no bounds, and they reveled in the thrill of their secret affair. One evening, after another passionate encounter, they stood together in the shower, the warm water cascading over their bodies as they washed away the evidence of their tryst. He held her close, his hands gliding over her wet skin, savoring the feel of her against him. They laughed together, their voices echoing off the tiled walls, their connection deeper than ever. But as the days passed, something began to change. His wife, Emily, once preoccupied with the children in her own life, started to notice the subtle shifts in his behavior. She saw the way he would disappear for long stretches of time, the way he seemed more attentive, more alive than he had in years. Her suspicions grew, a nagging doubt taking root in her mind. She watched him more closely, noticing the small, telltale signs that something was amiss, the way he would avoid her gaze, the sudden interest in grooming that had once seemed unimportant to him, the lingering scent of a perfume that wasn't hers. Though she said nothing, the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before it grew into something that neither of them could ignore. The tension in the household had been growing steadily. Emily, once blissfully unaware, had become increasingly alert to the changes in her husband. She noticed the way his eyes lingered too long on Priya, the way his demeanor brightened when she was around. The distance between them had grown more apparent, and though she hadn't yet confronted him, the doubt in her mind was festering. Then, one afternoon, it happened. Emily, determined to take back control of her home and her marriage, made a decision that would shatter the fragile world David and Priya had built together. With a firm tone that left no room for argument, she informed Priya that her services were no longer needed. The reason she gave was thinly veiled, something about the children not needing as much care now that they were older, but the underlying message was clear. She knew something was wrong, and she was putting an end to it. Priya packed her things in silence, her eyes casting furtive glances at David, who stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and despair. How could this be happening? Just as he had found a new source of joy, a rekindling of the passion he had long missed, it was being ripped away from him. As Priya walked out the door for the last time, David felt a surge of rage. He turned on his wife, his voice shaking with anger. "Why did you do that? She was helping us. Helping you." Emily stood her ground, her face set in a look of steely determination. "This is our home." She was no longer needed. Her cold, dismissive tone only fueled his frustration. He couldn't believe she could be so blind, so indifferent to what he was feeling. The void Priya left behind was immediate and suffocating, filling him with a desperate need to see her again. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became unbearable. He was a mess of conflicting emotions, guilt, anger, and longing, all swirling within him. Emily's suspicions were clearly growing, but she remained silent, her eyes watching him closely, every movement scrutinized. It wasn't long before his resolve crumbled. One evening, when the weight of his emotions became too much to bear, he made a decision that would seal his fate. Emily had gone to bed early, tired from a long day. He waited until he was sure she was asleep, then slipped out of the house, his heart racing as he drove to Priya's home. When he arrived, he parked a few houses away, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to calm his nerves. He knew this was dangerous, but the thought of seeing her again, of feeling her touch, was too powerful to resist. He pulled out his phone and sent her a message, his fingers trembling as he typed. "I'm here. I need to see you." There was a pause, and for a moment he feared she might not respond. But then his phone buzzed. "Come in. He's not home." He didn't need any more encouragement. He practically ran to her door, slipping inside as soon as she opened it. The moment the door closed behind them, they were in each other's arms, the tension and longing they had both been feeling erupting in a passionate embrace. Their lips met in a frantic kiss, their hands already pulling at each other's clothes, desperate to feel skin against skin. In the dim light of her bedroom, they fell onto the bed, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that was both familiar and urgent. Every touch, every kiss was a release of the emotions they had been holding back. He felt alive again, more alive than he had in years, as if every nerve in his body was on fire. The bed creaked beneath them, but they paid no mind, lost in the moment. The risk, the secrecy, the forbidden nature of their affair only added to the intensity of their connection. He kissed her with a desperation that bordered on madness, his hands gripping her tightly as if he feared she might slip away from him again. But as they moved together, the passion consuming them, neither of them heard the front door open. They were too lost in each other to notice the sound of footsteps approaching, too caught up in the ecstasy of their affair to realize they were no longer alone. Suddenly, the bedroom door burst open, and in an instant, their world came crashing down. Rajesh stood in the doorway, his face twisted in fury as he took in the sight before him his wife, Priya, in bed with another man, their bodies entwined in an act of betrayal so deep it made his blood boil. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. David and Priya froze, their eyes wide with shock and fear as they realized the gravity of the situation. The look of betrayal and rage in Raj's eyes was unmistakable, and in that instant they knew they were in grave danger. He didn't give them a chance to explain, to plead for forgiveness. With a roar of anger, he lunged at them, his fists flying as he lashed out in a blind fury. The room erupted into chaos, the sound of their struggle filling the small space as David fought to defend himself, to protect Priya. But it was no use. Rajesh was consumed by rage, his strength fueled by the pain of his wife's betrayal. And in that moment, as the violence unfolded before her, Priya knew that their secret had cost them everything. The moment of fury and betrayal turned deadly in an instant. Rajesh, overtaken by a blinding rage, lashed out with a force that neither David nor Priya could have anticipated. The room that had once been filled with stolen moments of passion was now a scene of horror. With a sudden, brutal motion, Rajesh grabbed a heavy object from the bedside table, a lamp, and swung it with all his strength at David's head. The sound of the impact was sickening, a dull thud that echoed through the room. David crumpled to the floor, his body limp, his life snuffed out in an instant. Priya screamed, her voice shrill with terror, but there was no one to hear her. She scrambled back on the bed, trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The fury in Rajesh's eyes was unrelenting, and he turned on her with a cold, merciless glare. "Please." "Don't," she begged, but her words were met with silence. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he lunged at her, his hands wrapping around her throat. She struggled, her nails clawing at his arms, but he was too strong. Her vision blurred as the air was cut off, her body growing weaker by the second. The life drained from her eyes as he choked her, the reality of her affair and the devastation it had caused flashing before her. Within moments, it was over. Her body lay still, lifeless on the bed where so many secrets had been shared. The room was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the murderer, his chest heaving with exertion and the remnants of his rage. Rajesh stood over the two bodies, his hands shaking as the weight of what he had done began to settle in. The anger that had driven him to this point was now replaced with a cold, creeping fear. He knew he had gone too far, that there was no turning back from the blood that now stained his hands. Panic took hold. He had to get out, escape before anyone found him. He fled the scene, stumbling out of the house and into the darkened streets. But as he made his escape, he was unaware of the security cameras lining the quiet neighborhood, capturing every frantic movement. The next day, the police were on the scene, the brutal double murder shocking the community. It didn't take long for the authorities to piece together what had happened. The CCTV footage from the street provided a clear view of Rajesh fleeing the scene, his face twisted with guilt and fear. His arrest was swift, the evidence against him overwhelming. In court, the case was straightforward. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of a man driven mad by jealousy and betrayal, his rage leading him to commit an unthinkable crime. The defense attempted to argue that the affair had pushed him to a breaking point, that he had acted in the heat of the moment, overwhelmed by the discovery of his wife's infidelity. But it wasn't enough. The jury saw through the desperation, the crime too heinous to justify. In the end, Rajesh was found guilty of murder, his fate sealed by the very evidence that had led to his capture. He was sentenced to life in prison, his life destroyed by a single moment of uncontrollable rage. The aftermath of the affair was devastating. Two families were left in ruins, their lives shattered by the actions of those they had loved and trusted. David's wife, Emily, was left alone, a widow mourning the loss of the man she had shared her life with, even as she grappled with the betrayal that had led to his death. Priya's children were left without a mother, their lives forever altered by a moment of passion that spiraled out of control. The affair that had once seemed so thrilling, so full of forbidden excitement, had cost them everything. In the end, it wasn't just two lives that were lost, it was the destruction of two families, torn apart by secrets, lies, and the deadly consequences of forbidden love.